My name is Young, and I'll be your host for today's webinar on how to integrate and automate security into the Kubernetes pipeline, from dev to production. Our guest speaker for today is Glen Kosaka, Vice President of Product Management at NeuVector. Glen will share best practices for integrating and automating critical security tasks into your pipeline, and we'll do a live demo on the NeuVector Container Security Platform that provides many cloud-native mechanisms to automate security. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box as we go through the presentation. Towards the end, we'll open up for Q&A. Okay, Glen, would you like to take it from here?
All right. Thank you very much, Young, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about today 10 steps to integrate and automate security into your pipeline. We've been working with many customers in their efforts to build security into their pipeline and automate it as much as possible. And each of our customers are at different phases of automation. So based on their experiences, I'm going to talk about some of the integration points, some of the key integration points, and how security can be automated. So first, take a high-level view of a pipeline going into production. This is a very simplified view, of course, but the pipeline is roughly, starting with the dev process and then moving as the dev team builds their images through a build server, puts them in a registry. The DevOps team or SRE team tests and exercises the QAs, the applications, and then those are pushed into production. Now, what are some of the top security concerns that you should be aware of in this pipeline? So the first is that critical vulnerabilities can be introduced really at any stage of the pipeline, all the way into production. For example, during the build phase, the use of open source software can introduce vulnerabilities. In a registry, even though you've successfully removed vulnerabilities and put your images into a registry, 30 days later, a critical vulnerability could have been announced for an image that you already have in your production registry. And then, of course, in production, when you have containers running in production, the same thing can happen. You can either have vulnerabilities that are newly discovered, or that you just there was no fix available, so that you just couldn't patch those in production. The second key concern is, and really why we're talking about automation today, is that the security team and the DevOps team really cannot afford to slow down the pipeline or even break or stop the pipeline. The whole reason for going to containers is to increase the velocity of releases so that your dev team can deliver better, more up-to-date code, new features, as well as have better resource utilization. And any slowdown or breaking or manual efforts that are needed to inject security into this pipeline can really impact the business and prevent the benefits of being realized. The third area is misconfiguration, and that can occur very early in the pipeline, even in your Jenkins build server with improper access controls or in the registries, but most painfully in your production environment, misconfigurations of your orchestrator, such as Kubernetes, or the hosts on which they run, can introduce vulnerabilities or security, present or open an attack surface. And by the way, as I go through the webinar today, feel free to ask questions in the question window, and then I'll save some time at the end to answer your questions. Now, in addition to the three I just talked about, in the production environment, there's also new attack surfaces. So, we've been focusing on the containers themselves and how they could be attacked. But what about the tools that are being used in the production environment? Specifically, what about the orchestrator or other critical tools that you're depending on? So Kubernetes itself could be attacked. And as we saw last year, critical API server vulnerability could be discovered, which enables someone to attack the API server and therefore bring down your containers. So all of the infrastructure presents a new attack surface that needs to be monitored and protected automatically. And finally, even though you've done the best job possible of removing vulnerabilities and locking everything down, there's still the ever-present danger of zero-day attacks, unknown vulnerabilities that are new exploits, or even insider attacks, people that are able to get into the infrastructures as phishing attacks or brute force attacks, and then able to, as a privileged user, be able to attack the infrastructure. So you're always going to have those concerns. So given that background, let's take a little bit deeper look into the production environment. So the reason that the production environment is so important, but at the same time it's so difficult to secure, is that it's always changing in a containerized environment. The scale at which either hosts are scaling up or containers are scaling up and down across hosts is tremendous, and keeping track of all those is difficult with traditional tools. And because containers are presenting an opportunity to move to a microservices architecture where containers are all talking to each other, you have an explosion of all this internal or east-west or pod-to-pod traffic. And it becomes difficult to automate security and integrate runtime security to protect against all that potential east-west traffic attacks. So it's very difficult to get the type of visibility you need. Insiders or zero-day attackers are becoming more sophisticated, and we talked about the new attack surfaces. So for those reasons, it's so critical to automate security as much as possible. You may not be able to do it on your first deployment of containers on Kubernetes, for example. You may not be able to have a fully automated pipeline, but it certainly helps to start down that path, and every release improve the automation so that at the end of the day, you can run at the velocity that you need to run. So let's take a look at some of these integration points. On the left side, in the shift left part of security, on the pipeline, one of the key integration points is in the build server stage. So for example, this could be Jenkins Server, Circle CI, Azure DevOps, any of the tools that you're using for CI/CD, you can invoke, and you should invoke, a vulnerability scan and an image check as the image is being built. So this is, when the dev team is building the image, and if needed, you can fail that image build if it has too many vulnerabilities or it doesn't meet your compliance standards. And that should be kicked back automatically to the dev team with the right type of alerts and remediation advice so that they can fix those before they even progress down the pipeline. The next stage would be the registry scanning phase. And so once the images are put into, let's say, a staging or production registry, as I mentioned, new vulnerabilities can be discovered. So those images should be continually scanned with new vulnerability info, as well as new images are going to be put in that registry all the time. So we need to make sure that all of the images in the registries are fully scanned. And then finally, the link between the pipeline and the production environment can be automated through admission controls. So rules should be set up to prevent vulnerable or unauthorized images being deployed into your production environment. Now, once you're in the production environment, it becomes much more difficult to automate all of the security needed to protect at runtime because there's many layers of security in the runtime environment. The top box we see here on runtime security is this whole area of network security. This is one of the most critical areas of runtime protection, which requires a layer 7 container firewall. And the reason is that if an attacker is going to get into your infrastructure or steal data, they're going to get in through the network, they're going to expand laterally through the network, and they're going to steal data through the network most likely. So it's critical to be able to implement this type of firewall, but how do we do this in such a way that doesn't require manual creation of firewall rules and inspection of those? How can we automate that process? Down here, we have other types of, you can think of these as the modern endpoint security capabilities, and that's the ability to inspect the actual application container for unauthorized processes or file activity and be able to potentially block those. And that's the same is true also for the host. How can we monitor the host so that there's not any unauthorized activity, and automatically run all of our compliance checks and CIS benchmarks, as well as vulnerability scanning for this entire infrastructure. So what I'm going to show you as an example is the various integration points and how NeuVector, using NeuVector as an example of how NeuVector can integrate into all of these parts of the pipeline. So I'm going to talk about 10 different steps and integration points. So the first area that we'll talk about is the whole end-to-end scanning, vulnerability scanning, and compliance and vulnerability management requirement. As I talked about, the first step is build scanning. That's fairly simple to be automated, and then that can be kicked back to developers if there's any vulnerabilities or problems. The second area that can also be automated is registry scanning. And if new vulnerabilities have been discovered in a registry, that also can be alerted and kicked back automatically to the dev team for remediation. Now, I'll talk later about the fact that there's not always a fix available for a vulnerability. So you may have to allow that to be deployed into production. And so that's why the whole production vulnerability scanning and compliance assessment is critical as well. It's important to know what your security posture is in production as well. So vulnerability scanning in production involves not just containers, but also scanning the host for vulnerabilities, as well as the orchestrated platform, the Kubernetes platform, OpenShift, or other platforms you may be using. The Docker and Kubernetes CIS benchmarks are pretty simple to automatically run and continuously run. So anytime a new container is deployed, a new host is added, any type of host is patched, those can alert you if any of the security settings have been inadvertently changed. Also, it's critical to be able to do compliance reporting and compliance management, perhaps even automated segmentation that some of these compliance, industry compliance requirements provide. And finally, risk reporting is critical to really manage the entire end-to-end vulnerability process. Now, on the other parts of the key steps for integration, I'm going to talk about how security policies code and behavioral learning can work together to really enable the dev and DevOps team to declare their runtime security policies early in the pipeline in the dev process, and then push those into the runtime environment. This is a critical part of automation that's going to enable you to avoid having to manually create rules to protect new applications and possibly slow down your pipeline. Admission controls, we talked about, as a key integration step for preventing unauthorized deployments. And then the firewalling and host security, as well as alerts and forensics, are also key areas of automation.
Glenn, this is Dawn.
Yep.
We had a question. Just want to break in for a sec.
Sure.
What are your recommendations for container orchestration threat modeling? Any framework or tool set for that purpose?
The question is on threat modeling just for the orchestrators themselves, for the API server, or for the actual workloads that are running on the orchestrators? I probably need some clarification on that, but ultimately, the orchestrator as well as specific applications can be vulnerable to attacks or vulnerability exploits. So the community is constantly looking for vulnerabilities in, for example, the Kubernetes API server. And those are being addressed as they occur. Now, what I'm going to talk about is more of a declarative security model, which is whitelist based. And that is to define the allowed behaviors of any specific application before it moves into production, and therefore, any unauthorized activity on that application can be deemed, a potential attack. But I'll get to that later. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the examples of integration points or tools that you can integrate with in your pipeline. So if we start in the build stage, whatever tool you're using for your pipeline builds, that should be integrated with the security tool, specifically triggering vulnerability and image analysis. Secondly, as the images go into registries, they should be scanned, and there should be integration with those registries. The Docker and CIS benchmarks are all implemented and automated. Admission controls is actually a webhook service that's made available through Kubernetes and OpenShift. So any security tool should leverage the admission controls of the orchestrator themselves. For both initial deployment and ongoing updates of security tools, as well as security policies, such as those in NeuVector, the deployment can be fully automated as well. So whether it's Helm or a Red Hat operator, OpenShift operator, that can automate the deployment as well as the initial configuration through config maps. And CRDs, custom resource definitions, can be used to automate and update actual workload security policies. And I'll show an example of CRDs in a minute. There's clearly needs to be integration with the orchestration platforms to monitor what's going on, as well as to keep track of all the pods that are coming up and down. And all of the user management, just the basic Active Directory or LDAP and single sign-on, but also integrating with the RBACs that are provided by Kubernetes and OpenShift should also be created. And of course, on the monitoring side, whatever SIM tools are being used can be integrated very quickly and clearly with the security events and security tools. And then any extensions can be completed through a REST API, such as that's provided by NeuVector, as well as integration with any trouble ticketing systems, as an example, ServiceNow or Jira. So those are some examples to look for integrating into your pipeline. So let's take a look at steps 1 and 2 of the key steps in integration and automation. So, this is a screenshot of a typical Jenkins pipeline. It's similar in other tools where there's a series of jobs or steps involved. And at the point before this is put into a production registry, we would use a plugin or the REST API to trigger the NeuVector vulnerability scan. And if it passes the policy set in the scanner, this then progresses to the next stage, which is typically to push into a registry. If it doesn't pass, then this job has failed and the dev team is notified and the report for the vulnerabilities is presented back to the dev team so that they know what needs to be fixed. Once images are progressed or pushed into the production registry, again, this is where vulnerability scanning should take place. And then finally, the automated runtime scanning and CIS compliance checks all need to be completed. Now, in the case of compliance, for example, PCI requires segmentation and firewalling of in-scope and non-in-scope CDE traffic. And of course, you can't go, as you deploy new pods and all of a sudden they're running on a host and they're CDE, they're in scope, you can't be running around changing firewall rules manually. So how do you accomplish automated network segmentation that's required for PCI compliance? That's a critical aspect as well. And finally, I'm going to talk about this term called virtual patching of vulnerabilities. And that's really the capability to, even though you have a critical vulnerability running in a production environment, how do you protect against exploits on that vulnerability by virtually patching it, therefore giving your dev team a week or a few weeks to patch that and run it through your pipeline. So let's take a quick switch to a demo and show some of these concepts in action. Of course, I'm going to use the NeuVector console for that. This is a environment that's running. This happens to run on Google Cloud, but we have other environments running on AWS and AKS and IKS, and this can also run on OpenShift on-prem, any on-prem environment as well. So this is a 4-host environment, as I mentioned, on GKE, running NeuVector on all of these nodes. I won't get into the details of NeuVector. We can talk about deployment if there's any questions or in a future webinar. But we can see here that one of the key assets that I can define in NeuVector is a registry. And so let's say I've already used the NeuVector Jenkins plugin. It's passed the image checks for the vulnerability scanning there, and now we're putting these images into the registry. And if I look at these registry details, you can see that I can force rescanning automatically after we update the CVE database. So new vulnerabilities are going to be found in any existing images. We can also do a layered scan, and then we can also enable this to scan every few minutes or every hour, depending on how often I have new images put in the registry to make sure that those are scanned as well. And once the images are scanned, we can see the results of the image scans in the console itself. And this is what's called a layered scan result. So in this particular image, I'm sorry, I kept clicking on it. In this particular image, we can see here there's 56 high vulnerabilities. And in this particular layer of the image, 4 of these high vulnerabilities exist. You can see them here. You can research them. In this layer, you can see 37 high vulnerabilities. So this makes it easier for you to get back to your dev team, let them know what the build command was when you were building this image, and gives them better capability to figure out where to resolve or remediate this vulnerability if it needs to be fixed. And once we've done all the registry scanning, I'll talk later about how we can integrate that with the admission control capability. But let's take a look at other types of vulnerability scans. That was registry scanning, but we also will scan, as I mentioned, the hosts, the running hosts. So we can see here there's 27 high vulnerabilities on this COS from Google. We can also see what version we're running of Kubernetes, and we can see if there are any vulnerabilities of the Kubernetes orchestrator as well. So it looks like they've remediated those. And then we can also switch to the container view, and we've turned on automated container scanning so that anytime a container starts to run, it will be automatically scanned for vulnerabilities, as well as the CIS and Kubernetes and Docker benchmarks. So if we look at a specific container, like this front end, we can see all the vulnerabilities that exist in that container, as well as the results of the Docker and Kubernetes CIS benchmarks. You can also see here that it's possible to add your own custom scripts, which are your own custom compliance checks, and have those run and see those results and automatically run those as well. So that part of automation is pretty straightforward. Now, let's take a look at how we can do end-to-end vulnerability management based upon all of those vulnerabilities that we've detected. So in the security risk tab under vulnerabilities, think of this as like a little explorer tool that enables you to analyze vulnerabilities and see the impact of them in a running or production environment. So if I sort them by urgency, I can also filter them by only looking for those with a fix or without a fix, the level, or filtering them by namespaces or other criteria. And then I can download reports for those as well. Now let's take a look at, let's just pick the the top vulnerability that I see here. We can, of course, research this vulnerability in more detail, but the really interesting thing here is the impact this vulnerability has. We can see here in a glance that 57 images are impacted by this vulnerability. 4 hosts, all the 4 hosts have this vulnerability running on it, and 12 containers are affected by this vulnerability. So let's take a look at the details here on the right. We can see the impacted version and what you have to do to fix that version. And as we scroll down, we can see the images that have this vulnerability. The images in black do not have a container running this vulnerability. And so in a way, they're less priority for you. However, the images in blue do have a container running with this vulnerability. And we can see in this column here, there's a bunch of red. So the black means there's a bunch that are unaffected, but red means alert. There's a critical vulnerability running in production that's unprotected by NeuVector. So let's take a look at some of the details as we scroll down. Those are the images. We can see some of the images here that the light blue means they're unprotected, and the purple means that they are protected by NeuVector. So we can also see that there are 4 hosts running this vulnerability, and the purple means that they're protected in the protect mode by NeuVector. Here are the containers that are running in production that have this vulnerability. And if I click on the node pods here, you can see that they're in a monitor mode. So when you're in a monitor or protect mode in NeuVector, that means we have characterized and locked down that container. So no unauthorized network, process, or file activity is going to be allowed without you being alerted. If this was in protect mode, we would actually block any of those unauthorized activities. However, if we look at these light blue containers, we can see that this is running in a discover mode still, and that is, it's completely open. Any activity is going to be allowed. And so we either need to remove that vulnerability from this container right away, or we need to lock this down by switching it into the monitor or protect mode. So this is a convenient way to really understand what your vulnerability exploit risk is in your production environment. And you can consider these node pods and others that are protected by NeuVector as virtually patched by NeuVector. So that is the term that I use to explain what virtual patching is. Let's take a little bit deeper look into what exactly is virtual patching. So the first thing to understand is NeuVector will learn and whitelist all of the behavior of the containers and microservices and applications you're deploying. And so we're going to learn the network, the process, and the file activity in every container. And any unauthorized network, process, or file access can be blocked when you're in that protect mode. What that means is that even though there's a critical vulnerability, there is virtually no chance that that vulnerability can be exploited in this container without some unauthorized network, process, or file activity being detected. The same is true not just for vulnerability exploits, but if you had embedded malware, for some reason got into your image and started up, that would be detected. Zero-day attacks, as well as insider or phishing attacks. All of those things would be detected by NeuVector. And in a protect mode, we would block those. I'll talk a little bit more about how we learn and whitelist and what those policies look like. But virtual patching is a very powerful concept to protect vulnerabilities in production, because we all know that there's not always a fix available for a vulnerability. So sometimes we have to run in production until a patch is available or until our dev team is able to get to it. So now let's take a look at the next steps, 5 and 6, and let's see about how security policies, code, and behavioral learning can work together to automate the creation and deployment of these workload security policies that I talked about. Here we have our typical pipeline that we talked about: a build server, NeuVector scanning, registry scanning. It's going over to the QA team. The DevOps team is going to deploy this app. Now, what's happening behind the scenes is that the dev team, as they're building their app, is also building that YAML file, which is that deployment manifest. And that's being used by the QA team to test it and then to deploy it into production. Now, we should also be able to create a security manifest that's also in a Kubernetes native YAML file that can prescribe what application behavior is allowed in this application, and that can be pushed into the production environment to protect those workloads and bound those, or virtually patch those, as I mentioned. The key question here is, who's going to create this security policy code? Is it dev? Is it the DevOps team? Is it security? Can we really train dev to learn and care about security? The good answer is that it doesn't matter. Whoever in your organization you charter with being responsible for this security policy, you can enable them and enable them to automate this process. So here's a possible workflow. You follow the same workflow. The DevOps team and QA team goes down here. They deploy the application that's being tested in a testing QA environment, and they also have NeuVector running there. So NeuVector uses its behavioral learning to learn all of the network process and file activity, create that policy rule for you, and then you can export that and give that to the dev team to review and edit. Let's say that there needs to be edits to the protocols being used by the app, or the connections needed, or the processes that are going to run in the app. Those can now be created as a version 1 security manifest that can be tested again before it's deployed into production. The good news is that in addition to workload-specific policies being defined in that fashion, if you have a central compliance or security team, they can also define global security policies, such as no SSH is allowed in a container, or no SCP is allowed in a container. So it supports global security policies that aren't workload-specific as well. So let's go back to my demo environment to show you a quick demo of that. So let's say I've got my applications running in this GKE test environment. And if I filter my application groups by my demo group, I can see that I have my Nginx, my Node, and my Redis pods identified and running. So if I take a look at one of them, I can see that NeuVector has learned specific network rules for this particular application workload. And this would happen as you run test traffic through the application. You can see here there's certain rules. These are layer 7 firewall rules that NeuVector automatically created. We also created process rules by observing the processes running in the container. And we've locked it down into a monitor mode. So by reviewing all these and customizing if needed, I can now say, okay, I'm ready to review with the dev team and push into production. So now I can go into my capability called Export Policy Group, and I can pick the application stack that I've just tested. I can export it. What's going to happen here is we're going to export this as a CRD Kubernetes native YAML file, which expresses all those rules in a Kubernetes native YAML file format. So if I open that exported CRD, I can see, for example, that Nginx pod is allowed to talk to Node using HTTP. And if my dev team tells me, well, we're also going to allow SSL connections, I can just add that here. I can also see that the certain processes are allowed to run in the application as well. And let me see where some of my processes are. Here we go. So I don't want curl to run in this container because I use that just for demos, so I can delete that. Also, I can see that when I deploy this into the demo namespace, I'm going to deploy this particular one into monitor mode. But if I want to change that to protect mode, I can change it here. So let's say this is approved. We're going to version this, put it in our change management system to deploy as our production security policy for these apps. And so once I save that and version it, now let's say I'm going to switch over to a different cluster. This is a K8S, so this is a cluster running on Azure. Let's say that this is my production environment. So now I want to push that policy into the production environment. I don't really want to enable manual creation of these rules once I'm in the production environment. So I simply go into this environment and I do a kube control create of that YAML file that we talked about. And those rules will be pushed into my Azure production environment. Now it looks like my browser is loading a little slow here.
Possibly, Glenn, because it seems like people are still stuck on the, or it's probably slow. I see right now the YAML, and you have monitor highlighted.
Okay. So it's a little behind, I think. So let me just explain what I was going to show, and then we could move on just in the interest of time. So what I was going to show is once you push those policies into your production environment, you'll see them show up as CRD rules. And CRD rules are not allowed to be edited by a local cluster admin. You have to edit those rules by editing that YAML file. So it really becomes the security policy of record and can be automated into your pipeline just like any policy is controlled by your change management system. Now I'm going to go into steps 7 through 10. So, this is a summary of the capabilities of the NeuVector Container Security Platform. And I've highlighted in red the areas of steps 7 through 10, which you should consider for automation. So the first is deployment of NeuVector itself, configuration of NeuVector using Helm, Operator, and ConfigMat. The second is the ability to create admission control rules to block unauthorized deployments or vulnerable deployments into the production environment. The third area is the ability to enforce runtime protection, and that's really automated blocking of network connections, of processes, or file activity that should not be happening, either in a container or on the host. You can add to that the ability to inspect the network traffic for PII, credit card data, account data, using network DLP. So the capability for the network container firewall to inspect data to see if somebody is sending unencrypted data around your network or trying to steal it, and block that is also an automation that can be incorporated. And then finally, the ability to automate the forensic capability and response. So that could be initiating a packet capture on a suspicious pod that could have been hacked, or quarantining that container. We provide a number of different rules that enable you to specify conditions under which a quarantine is invoked on a container, which would block all network traffic in or out of it, or a packet capture is initiated on that container. And of course, other alerting and response, whether that's SIM, webhook alerts, or other types of response, are also something that can be automated. I'm going to the network activity screen where we show all the containers running in a visual map and all the network connections between them. And in this view, we can see attacks that are showing through red line, and we can click on any container at any point in time and see all of the details, all of the vulnerabilities of it. We can also see the active network sessions going in or out of a container. We can initiate a packet capture, and we can manually or in an automated way quarantine a suspicious container. So if I quarantine a container, a red line appears around it, indicating that all network connections in or out of it are being blocked. If I look at the packet capture, I can see that we automatically started some packet captures here because of a suspicious activity, and those can be downloaded or exported in the form of PCAP files for forensic investigations or just for immediate detection of attacks as well. That's a summary of some of the key integration points of your CI/CD pipeline and how NeuVector can be used to integrate and secure that. Now, what I haven't done is dived into a lot of detail in terms of how to set up security policies or how NeuVector creates layer 7 rules or egress controls or custom policies. Those are all things that please contact us if you'd like to dive deeper into any of the runtime security policies or other capabilities of NeuVector. But I really just wanted to highlight the integration and automation points in the pipeline and how NeuVector could fit into that. It's certainly something that many of our enterprise customers are trying. Some of them have fully automated pipelines, including deployment of NeuVector and on new clusters for every new client they receive, pushing configuration and workload policies out, and automating the response and the alerting. Others are still starting at the beginning, maybe on the left side of the pipeline, integrating the build level scanning and registry scanning and making sure they have that initial part of vulnerability management configured properly. And then the runtime protections are currently being managed through the console. So it doesn't matter, where you start, but I think my advice would be to get started on integrating and automating as much as possible. All right, thanks for listening. Maybe we could go to some questions if there's any questions, Jan.
All right, so the first question is, Glenn, can we configure the private registry?
Absolutely. NeuVector can be configured to scan any number of registries, and not just the entire registry, but you can also put filters in there for specific repositories or directories in that registry. And so those can be scanned, whether they're cloud registries or on-prem private registries.
And then do you provide any support to evaluate fast whether a patch for base images, externally pulled images is available? And is it considered an anti-pattern or patch vulnerabilities in external images yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to look at the layers of the image. So if you're using a base image layer in many of your images, we're going to identify the vulnerabilities in that. Even if it's discovered later that there's a vulnerability in that base image, we're going to be able to tell you where we see that, and then be able to help you identify which resulting images need to be patched.
Okay. And then is there a standard or framework on a security checklist for CI/CD pipeline?
A standard or a checklist. So certainly start with the Docker and Kubernetes CIS benchmarks. They provide a number of checks on the orchestrator, on the host, on the containers. For example, they'll identify if there's any running as root or other misconfigurations. So, start there and then expand there. If you have custom checks, like you want to, we have a sample script that you can run on any container that checks for an Alpine root user with a null password, for example. So if there's specific checks you want to run, you can configure those in NeuVector, and we'll automatically run those and show you the results, just like we show you the CIS benchmark results.
There's another question. Can it detect application layer attacks, such as DNS tunneling, DDoS?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't go too much into all of the network protections. I talked about segmentation and automated segmentation through whitelist rules that NeuVector does through the container firewall. But in addition to that, we also have built-in network threat detection. So we look for DNS tunneling, ICMP, DNS attacks, SQL injection attacks, DDoS attacks. So a number of network attacks we will detect out of the box, and if we detect those, in those cases, we'll automatically do the packet capture. So we save that, and you could either download that or take a look at it live through the console.
Okay, and then we have, can you please elaborate on CI user role privileges, permission, and usage?
Well, CI being the entire pipeline, right? I mean, so user roles and privileges need to be addressed for every tool in that pipeline, I think, if that's the question. Everything from who's allowed to get in there and configure your Jenkins build pipeline or whatever tool you're using, and then configure what the fail policy is of the NeuVector scanner in that tool. Also, who's allowed to access your registries and configure new repositories, or allowed to put images into that registry. So there's a number of user roles that need to be very carefully evaluated. The good thing is, with a layered security approach like NeuVector, we're going to check a number of different things all along the way. So with admission controls, you can restrict which users are allowed to deploy, Kubernetes users, for example. Same as for who's deploying the CRD that I mentioned, the security policy as code, is all integrated with Kubernetes RBACs. So if a certain user is only allowed to deploy into a certain namespace, they will only be allowed to deploy a CRD policy into that namespace, and Kubernetes will reject them if they try to deploy a security policy into a different namespace. And then, of course, there's user roles all the way into production. Who's managing NeuVector? So we integrate with single sign-on as well as LDAP and Active Directory to enforce those rules. We also do an automated integration with OpenShift project RBACs. So if you're only allowed to access certain projects in OpenShift, we will read those in and only allow you to access certain or view certain projects in NeuVector as well.
And then with all these attacks, will it be shown as alerts? And does it have behavioral detection? And based on what the attacks are detected?
We do, I talked about the network threat detection. We do behavioral detection of the network patterns. We also do behavioral detection of a little bit more sophisticated attacks, such as privilege escalations or Apache struts exploits, where it really, or even a DNS tunnel, for example, requires you to correlate different types of behavior. That could be a new process starting up, a reverse shell, or a certain process that we know could be malicious, but we need to correlate that with a corresponding network attack or network session that we see starting up at the same time. So we have certain built-in behavioral detection for those live runtime attacks. But in addition to that, of course, I talked about the behavioral learning where we learn all the normal behavior of your application in that staging or test environment and then can whitelist that.
What are your better practices concerning isolation and segregation of duties?
That's multiple levels of questions. Isolation and segregation of duties, for example, that's required by PCI, and that's for users, RBACs, roles, having the proper roles for who's allowed to access which types of tools, even who's allowed to download those packet captures that I talked about. So there's that level, and then there's isolation and segmentation of network traffic, which is often a requirement in many compliance, industry compliance standards, including PCI, which requires you to have a network firewall to segment CDE and non-CDE traffic. So all of those can be accomplished in some way or form with NeuVector.
And then how can multiple tenants be isolated from each other on the same Kubernetes cluster?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's related to what I just answered, which is, a tenant could be a CDE in scope application running across multiple nodes in a Kubernetes cluster, and those need to be isolated or segmented from other non-CDE traffic. But it could be you're running multiple clients in a single Kubernetes cluster, and let's say you want them in different namespaces. So NeuVector will learn the behavior, will automatically segment that with network rules. They don't even have to be in the same namespace. That's not a limitation of NeuVector. Even if they cross namespaces or have egress, NeuVector will learn that network behavior and allow the segmentation through the network firewall of all that traffic.
Okay, since we're hitting the top of the hour, I guess that will be our last question for today. So if you guys still have any more questions, please feel free to continue writing them in the chat box, and we'll get back to you to respond through email. Or if you want to reach out to us, go ahead and feel free and do that. But under handouts, we've added the NeuVector Kubernetes Security Guide and the overview data sheet for your reference. This webinar was recorded, so a follow-up email with the recording will be sent to you shortly after. And then I want to thank everyone for attending. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Don. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Young. Thank you, Don. Thanks for everyone for joining me today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.